The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
And welcome to our program today on Faith Matters on the Talk Station. I'm Ben Ball, and along with me today is Reverend Mark Woods from Cherry Point United Methodist Church, and also Dr. Ron Monteperdo from Carteret Community College. Well, good day, gentlemen.
Good morning, Ben.
Hey, good morning there, Ben.
All right, today we'll look at a number of different articles and different perspectives, and one is big news that came out during the week this week. It was about the effort and the moves by the Obama administration to move towards a normalized relations with Cuba. We have been separate and apart from Cuba in terms of our relations, other than having a what is it called? It's called a station, Ron. It has a particular...
There's an American interests section the Swiss Embassy in Havana.
Right. All right. The American interest section has been very active, though, or has been active anyway, since we left the diplomatic relations, or cut those diplomatic relations in, 61? 1961. Yeah. For Mark, for you, that's been a lifetime that we've had a Cuban embargo. And in fact, this is the dichotomy that we're seeing in some of the reaction between the announcements yesterday that would ease certain restrictions and allow for certain travel, certain economic exchanges to take place. Everything short, basically, of what would need congressional approval. Any further eroding of that embargo would need a congressional approval, and that may be unlikely. But it brings up some other things. One of the players who was involved in brokering this deal was Pope Francis. And an article that's in USA Today says a personal appeal by Pope Francis played a key role in finalizing a deal to open relations between the United States and Cuba for the first time in 53 years. The Pope wrote a personal letter to President Obama this fall, something he'd never done before, and a separate letter to Cuban President Raul Castro. The letter invited leaders to resolve humanitarian questions of common interest, including the situation of certain prisoners, end quote, according to a Vatican statement, congratulating the two countries on Wednesday. And apparently they met or there were some delegations that met in Canada. It's been going on for, I think, about a year and a half or so. The statement from the Vatican continued to say the Holy See will continue to assure its support for initiatives which both nations will undertake to strengthen their bilateral relations and promote the well-being of their respective citizens. Ron, you've had a lot of experience in international relations. Is this a game changer?
It's a game changer because it gives overt reality, or it makes overt reality a process that's really been going on for at least 20 years. Both sides have wanted to restore relations. One of the problems was that the Cuban what I would refer to as the Cuban refugee vote in the United States, or their political power, was really very, very strong, and no president, Republican or Democrat, was able to buck it. That generation is died off. They aren't as strong as they used to be. It's their children and grandchildren who are participating in politics now. They tend still to be fairly conservative and all of that, but they don't have the same feeling of antagonism toward Castro. So from the political process, the economic and other motivation to normalize relations has been there for many, many years. The political obstruction that made that impossible has now begun to evaporate. Mm-hmm. And I think that the combination of those two has made this possible. I can't resist reflecting, as the oldest person around this table by a good number of years, In the 1950s, when I was in college, Fidel Castro was kind of a hero to us American college students. We saw him as a nationalist, as an independence leader, and a lot of Cubans saw him that way too.
Right.
And the communist Cuba didn't really emerge until after he had taken office, which we're coming up on an anniversary. He took power on New Year's Day, I think it was in '61 or sometime. And so it's the end of a long struggle.
And we weren't entirely opposed to that change in this country.
By no means.
The government wasn't entirely opposed either. I mean, we had supported Batista, I guess,
Yes,
and that had eroded.
Yes, and there was a lot of him. Castro was well thought of in this country. And
he could play baseball. He loved it. So. But now, all right. Now, let me set that aside. We'll come back to that, I think. But Mark, here we have Pope Francis, and not the first pope to exercise some influence in what had been a predominantly Catholic nation, is now by the current generation, so mostly has been or officially atheist. But Pope John Paul visited there. And did that get the ball rolling here for the pontiff or the Holy Sees to have influence in Cuba?
Yeah, I have several things to say here, Ben.
Okay.
No, I think it did get the ball rolling because I think the church thinks about history in a very different way. History for me, when I think about it personally, is only a few years deep because I'm not that old. But for the church, Francis doesn't see himself, I imagine, we don't see the figure of the Pope as being a kind of historical, singularity. Like, he is in continuity with what the church has gone. In fact, a lot of the Catholic faith is to preserve that continuity. So I definitely think that the popes that had come before him, that had visited, you mentioned John Paul II had visited, would make a big difference. One of the things that I think is very interesting about this article too is, and just about our political relations in general, is our main identity, I think, when we are just walking around and thinking about ourselves politically, we think of ourselves in national identities. We think of ourselves as American. We think of ourselves as Cuban. We think of ourselves as Bolivian. We think of ourselves in those national kinds of terms. And what Christianity does is, I think, it gives us another kind of identity in the sense that our primary identity comes from our baptism, our baptismal covenant with God. And so I heard someone quote a professor, so we're a couple steps removed from this, that suggested that we have more in common with Christians in Cuba than we do with a lot of our next door neighbors.
Why is that?
In the sense that our baptismal identity is our primary identity as Christians. So I think it's wonderful that the church would step in and say two nations would begin to find, and the interesting thing is, he said that for a humanitarian cause and for certain prisoners. I mean, that is straight out of Scripture, that we're to care for the prisoners. That is a significant theological issue. So for me, what I'm not saying is that baptism transcends our national identity. I'm American. I want to know that I'm American because it colors my thought of the world in a certain way. And I think we should be aware of that. But what gives me a primary identity of me being a person in the world, for me, is baptism. Is a Christian baptism, which then, if that's the primary identity, then we have a lot more in common with those in other countries who are also Christian than if they're not. And that's precisely why I think the church can do good stepping into these national things and try to, maybe on some level, transcend national boundaries. I hope that makes sense.
I think that was, Ron, I think that was certainly true with the end of the Soviet Union, is that there were certainly appeals to a religious and background and kind of faith stance that a number of the people took that went over the heads of the official political spectrum.
Would you like me to respond to that as a hard-nosed political
Sure.
scientist,
Yeah.
or as a as a confused Christian.
You take
I
your
prefer
pick.
the confused Christians
Confused
like us
Christian.
all.
All right, speaking as a confused Christian, Mark is absolutely 100% correct on this. I wasn't smart enough as he is to put it with baptism, but our Christian concerns for our fellow human beings, these are things that unite us.
Mm-hmm.
And they cross, or they trump, I would argue, they trump political issues and political problems.
Now, on that score, though, we certainly would want to look at Pope Francis as saying that this is my mission. I mean, to put that perspective of God first in all that I'm doing here. Now, what about though, as far as appealing to Raul Castro and to President Obama?
And as the hard-nosed political scientist, or I hope hard-nosed political science, it's much easier for heads of state to come together to solve human problems than it is to solve political problems. Notice they're cooperating to deal with humanitarian concerns, and that lets both sides off the hook, because you see and so I'm just glad it works out.
I mean, because we obviously had some other interests as well. I mean, the one prisoner wasn't the only one released. So
correct, and there is a question of American property that now has to be negotiated. That was seized by there's a question of sugar. I mean, Cuba runs on sugar, and trying to get sugar into this country, a whole bunch of very hard issues.
We'll come back to that in a moment here on Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back here to Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. And thanks for joining us here with Dr. Ron Monteperdo and Reverend Mark Woods. I'm Ben Ball, and we were talking in our first segment about the effort to normalize relations with Cuba and about how the Vatican had played a role in brokering those arrangements. And of course, the Vatican expressing that on its humanitarian grounds. And let me come back to, though, on the political side of that, Ron as a political scientist, as you said, hard-nosed political scientist view. Let's talk about how the reaction, though. We mentioned that kind of in the very beginning of the segment, we alluded to this, is that there is a young and there's an old reaction to that. Is that those who fled Cuba, and that was one of my first experiences with anybody from Cuba, was a next-door neighbor who fled, who had been a lawyer in Cuba and was one of the intellectuals who was routed out and either jailed or had to escape. And he was able to get out and eventually could get his family out. Not until the probably mid and late 60s late 60s could he get his family out. But and his experience was he didn't talk a great deal about it, but his experience was that that Cuba has all of these possibilities, and that people that felt like Castro was the first Castro was going to realize all of these great possibilities, but it was soon evident that it was going to be a dictatorship that was not going to be quite what they thought. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a very fair statement, and I think the United States government bought into that as well, and it informed U.S. policy to Cuba up until the very early '60s, when there had been some concerns expressed, but they were expressed for the most part by the Batista holdovers, and they were that criticism was not heeded. However, subsequent events proved them to be right, and basically it was when Castro took over, he took that entire, you might call it an elite, but he took that educated professional class, and by definition he destroyed it, and mostly by driving him off the island, by driving him to the United States. And I think the only reason he did was because he lacked the ability to put him in jail and keeps him in jail.
Well, so you also had not only that exit of all that knowledge, but also obviously of industry.
Industry, and well, there wasn't much industry. What you had was the expropriation
Right.
of, frankly, American-held interests and American-held property, which was one of the things that also got Castro some credit with his own people, because he did seize control of a lot of economic organizations that were essentially owned by the United States. So there was a nationalist component to it as well.
Sure. Yeah.
And what he tried to do was, I think, to take an industrial class, a working class, and make it the master of Cuba. He was going to fulfill Cuba's destiny, its nationalism, by combining it with an economic revolution, which is worth noting. It's what the Chinese decided to do. It's what the North Koreans tried to do. It's what the Vietnamese tried to do. It's what had happened elsewhere in Latin America. It was very much part of the politics of the time.
Now, also though, religion was also seen as an enemy of the state. Yes. And I know my neighbor was staunchly Catholic. And of course, certainly celebrated that in the U.S. Now, the only other example I know is a young lady who's in her 30s, who's a Cuban emigre, and she did not grow up with a faith background, by that next generation. Now, here comes along the Holy See, and they are involved, Mark, both with Pope John Paul. I think it was a youth rally. Essentially, it was what took John Paul II to Cuba, and then it was, and then we have Pope Francis trying to intercede, not necessarily by visiting, but by appealing to the humanitarian side. Do you think that we should be also seeking then, not only in those normalized relations, but we should be seeking a religious expression or some concessions there that the people should be allowed to freely express their faith? I mean, this
is an interesting question, Ben, because I think that this gets to the question of, I'm going to sound crazy when I say this, and that's all right. I haven't been on in a couple of weeks, so I'm about due.
We haven't had your crazy in a while.
Yes, I know. We tout religious freedom and tolerance. We tout it as it is a universal virtue. Like religious freedom, no one's going to say, at least here in America, religious freedom is a bad thing. No one's going to say that. You know what I mean? But with anything, there always comes its opposite. Like when we want religious freedom, we want it to a certain extent until another religion infringes upon another religion. And then what do? You have
right.
two. We want tolerance, but we're only tolerant of those who want to be tolerant. You know what I mean? And so I'm not
call
sure.
it the Sharia law exception.
Yeah, maybe
that's what the U.S. argument would be.
Yeah, and I'm just not sure that the religious freedom that we usually talk about here in America is the virtue that we claim it to be. That being said, I don't think that the issue for Cuba at this point in this whole thing that has went down between Obama and Raul Castro, that religious freedom, like Ron said, they can dodge the bullet because they can focus upon humanitarian concerns, prisoners, and that kind of thing. I think the way religious freedom will work itself out in Cuba as it works itself out in America is when we start to be together on some things. Meaning when we begin to somehow worship together or to even cross boundaries. Does that make sense? Like actually being with one another on some level. I don't think you can policy religious freedom. I think we try. But on this show all the time we talk about the failure of our policies of religious freedom. The Hobby Lobby issues and all those issues that come up, the marriage issue right now, all of that. I think that it hinges on that. So I think it'll come down to when we actually start living together on some level.
One of the prisoners, of course, the prisoner not identified is the real prize here. That was the intelligence asset that had been held there for 20 years. But Alan Gross, who was the one who was also released, is Jewish. And one of the supposedly reasons he was there was actually to try to help get information in and out of the Jewish community. And he thanked in his first meeting with the press on the way back. He thanked all the different faiths, including Muslim faiths and Christian and Jews, who had been supporting his release. And so this wasn't without a faith background that some of these actions took place, or within, with that as a backdrop, put it that way.
Well,
and Ron, yeah.
Well, go ahead, Mark, please.
Just real quick. We in America separate between political issues, policy issues, this other thing. For us Christians, those are theological issues. This is all a theological issue. Prisoners, humanitarian concerns, religious freedom, economics, businesses going over there and coming back is what Ron, was talking about. Those are theological issues. There is nothing outside of that. So for Francis to have an interest in this, and for all of us Christians to have an interest in, is a theological issue. We like to separate them out, but I don't think that they are separated. Go ahead, Ron. I'm sorry.
It is a theology. Yes, of course, it is a theological issue. I only wish that we were consistent about in our relations with other human beings as to whether we're going to conduct them on the basis of theology or other things, which is the tragedy of, where we live in a fallen world and so on. Specifically, this is only the nose of the camel is now under the tent. And I would expect that there will be, I can't imagine any Castro-led regime that is ever going to come out in favor of religion. I can't think of any Castro regime that is going to make it easy for religion. But that said, they will begin to deal with it in a more sensitive fashion. And
one of the things in the old Soviet Union, in Russia, for example, and then a little bit to the same degree in China, what they have allowed is people who had been there before in Russia, folks who had been there, religious outlets who had been there before, had been established before, can come back, but they weren't allowing any new ones to come in. So you could see that. You could certainly see the Catholic Church being reestablished in Cuba.
We could do that, and we also have to remember that the church in Castro times was a different church. It had social connections and economic connections and interests that it no longer has. And it is a softer, it is a more sensitive.
You certainly could say politically that the Catholic Church in Latin America, in Central and South America, and in Caribbean nations, etc., had much more of a political stance.
Much more. And that political stance and that political power, I think, has in a lot of ways been broken as a result of things that happened in Latin America in the 60s and in the 70s. And the church has now turned around. So the concept of religion in Latin America and in Cuba doesn't have the same resonance. It doesn't have the same qualities that it had in the 50s and in the 60s. It's a different kind of religion, if that makes any sense.
It's not the Berrigan brothers anymore.
It's not the Berrigan brothers anymore. It's a
bake sale.
It's not the Papal Knights anymore. It's not the Berrigans anymore. It's a much more sensitive religion.
We'll have other things to say here coming up on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240, with Dr. Ron Monteperdo, political scientist at Carteret Community College, and also Reverend Mark Woods, pastor at Cherry Point United Methodist Church. I'm Ben Ball. And Mark, you brought an article to us today that a number of, as people are actually riding to church, as they're listening to this on a Sunday morning, they may be hearing these passages as we go through the Sunday morning worship service on the Magnificat. Tell us about this article and what that is.
Yeah, it's just an article about the Magnificat. The Magnificat is the Song of Mary, and it is one of the lectionary passages for the Revised Standard Lectionary for the fourth Sunday of Advent. So it comes up for us Methodists and Episcopalians and usually Roman Catholics as well, and Lutherans. And did I leave anybody out, Ron?
Yeah, well, there might be a few others.
There might be a few others. It comes up in the lectionary, and it is the way this song works. It's a song of Mary. Mary goes and sees Elizabeth. They're both pregnant. Elizabeth's 6 months pregnant. Mary's just pregnant. She goes to the town of Judea, and she says, this is where we get the line, blessed are you among women, that we get in the Hail Mary. And she sings this song. And this song is kind of a song of liberation, or the lifting of oppression, of the rich are sent away empty, and the poor are fed, the hungry are fed, and the powerful are torn down, and the oppressed are lifted up. And it's just and the article suggests that we have kind of misread the text by taking away the sting of the text. And I think for us, in at least in my context as an American United Methodist, it does sting a little bit. It stings particularly during Christmas, when we are so preoccupied with other things, and yet this makes a significant economical statement about what God is doing in the world. I feel like it was an interesting article because it challenged, especially us pastors, when we get up there, to be a little bit more faithful to the text than we usually are. I put myself in there as well. Okay.
So, there's also some debate as to whether or not it was Mary who actually said that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, some ancient authorities say that it was Elizabeth. That Elizabeth sings this song. And obviously the song is pulled straight from Samuel. A lot of the language is the same song that Hannah sings when she finds out that she's pregnant with Samuel, and she was barren, and now God has given her a child. It's the same kind of thing with Mary. And it's just a song for the oppressed. It's kind of a song of liberation on some level. But yeah, Elizabeth or Mary, that's right.
But and it may make a slight difference in its how it's used. But in any case, Ron, you've sat in the pew and you've heard this certainly every season, if not more often. Has it ever had that impact upon you about maybe this is a revolutionary statement?
I can't say that I've ever consciously thought of it as a revolutionary statement. But as is so often the case when I sit around this table, I've been challenged to think of it differently. My own thinking is not quite so sophisticated. She's singing about God entering space and time. God is becoming us. He's becoming one of us. And I try to spend time thinking about what that means for me. Mm-hmm. And in the face of all of that love, I have to conclude that it's impossible not to think about those to think about other people. It has implications for what we do if we're wealthy. It has implications for what we do if we're not wealthy. And it calls upon us to change ourselves. I don't mean to be getting into a sermon here, but
that's all right. It's Sunday morning. You're allowed.
But it calls upon us to change. I mean, God is now among us. That completely blows my mind. And the world's different. And the question is, how am I different? How are we different? Mm-hmm. And inevitably that takes us to matters of economic relations and social relations and power relations, which are all mixed up together. And I think it calls for a radical re-examination of all of those things. Mm-hmm. And
Mark is smiling over here.
There's such a wonderful passage. Let's throw ourselves at this imaginatively. And when my children were in utero, a popular thing to do is to listen to music. Have you ever heard of this? Like pregnant
sure.
women
Yeah.
listening to music.
There's even
and
headphones, all kinds of stuff.
And yeah, that's right. Baby headphone things that fit on, And the thing that we had our children listening to was two things. One was Bach, of course. Who are we going to listen to? We're going to listen to Bach. Probably Tom Waits in the car. We listened to a little Tom Waits and maybe some John Prine, which I know, Ben, we've had John Prine arguments.
Discussions, yes.
So Bach, John Prine, Tom Waits. Here is Mary with
really
Jesus.
must be mixed up.
With Jesus, my kid. Yes, that's of course the true. With Jesus and John the Baptist being in the womb, let's think about this imaginatively. If she sings this, this is the songs that they hear in the womb. Mm-hmm. That and who does John the Baptist become? He becomes this crazy person in the wilderness preparing the way for the Lord, which was the second Sunday of Advent. I'm sorry.
Right.
And I just find it really interesting that this is the way in we're in Luke, right? Yeah. Luke's gospel, right in the beginning, first chapter of Luke, this is how Luke portrays the songs in utero for Jesus. Mm-hmm. It's not Bach, and I guess that's anachronistic.
But also, these verses though are staged in the past tense. I mean, as you said, they're taking them from Samuel, and isn't that significant though? I mean, it says that he has done these things,
right? Yeah. Perhaps you should read a little bit of it. I don't know if you've pulled it up or not. I have it here if you want me to read it. Yeah. He hath put down the mighty from their seat. He hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He remembering his mercy hath helped his servant Israel, as he promised to the forefathers Abraham and his seed forever. That's kind of the end of it. That's the more economical sting part of it. But you're right; it is in the past tense.
So is that saying are Mary and Elizabeth then celebrating? I think you alluded to this, Ron. Is that this is a better world with God in it? I mean, is that the illusion here now? Is that now it's God made flesh?
Yeah, and what Ron said, I think, was exactly right. This is God breaking in, and they're recognizing God breaking in. This is what God has done. This is the Holy Spirit coming upon Mary, or even Elizabeth.
But even in a prophetic sense, it's what God has done.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that's in Samuel. That's Hannah's point as well. Mm-hmm. That in a very prophetic sense, it is opening up a space, not only that God has done this, but that this is who God is and will be. This is what God does in the world. God takes the lowly and exalts them. God takes the proud and throws them down. This is prophetic in the sense of not just telling the future or talking about now, but also talking about what God has done and will do. So yeah, I think that's right, Ben.
Yeah. Present today and always. Okay.
Yeah. I have a question about when we say God throws down the proud. Mm-hmm. We don't mean that he punishes the proud necessarily.
Humbles them.
Or that he humbles them in a way that causes them pain or humiliation or anything. Because God wouldn't do that.
No, I think it's enlightenment.
It's enlightenment, yeah. You see, and that's what it's revolutionary for everybody. Now, there's a part of me that I just like to see the proud and the arrogant thrown down and humiliated, and I admit to that.
And using modern vehicles to run them over.
Or using and all of that, and that's my problem. Okay. But the thing that makes it so wonderful is that it's a call for everybody to undergo this change.
So go ahead, Mark.
It's used in Scripture too. In fact, in the Book of Common Prayer, it is a piece of the evening service of worship, constantly. Mm-hmm. It is to be used. That or another canticle. It says, I think, in the Book of Common Prayer, the Magnificat, and it's used every single week. And what I find interesting about this, and the only reason I talked about Jesus hearing in his womb, is it forms us when you read stuff like this even the language that makes us uncomfortable, Ron, about throwing down the proud and the mighty, it forms and shapes us in a certain way. And if the Magnificat is used, it's in the Methodist hymnal as well, as a responsive reading there. But if it's used, it forms us to think in a certain way.
Is this in the same sense? I mean, we don't talk a whole lot about corporate worship here, but some of these traditions. What is it in Jewish history? The Shema, is that what it's called?
The Shema.
Shema.
The Shema.
Yeah, and that expression is to be said daily.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. In fact, it's on the doorposts and everything. I mean, it is.
Again, as a reminder.
That's right.
Of who we are and who we owe who we are.
Is to pick up Mark's point, in every monastery, the monks or sister or convent, the monks, the sisters, end their day with this.
That's right.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I think
didn't
that's
know
right.
that.
It is right. I mean, yes.
I know that's right in the Greek Orthodox tradition.
And in the Roman Catholic and Anglican traditions.
So it has an important place, and it's significant that it brings forward Hannah's song.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's significant in its economical concern and its oppression concern. And I think this connects with what we talked about before in Cuba. That, these these economic issues, these political issues of prisoners and humanitarian concerns are a kind of gospel theological concerns. This Magnificat speaks to those kinds of things.
We'll have more to come in our final segment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Hope you can stay with us. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240, and I'm Ben Ball. I'm joined here today with the Reverend Mark Woods from Cherry Point United Methodist Church and Dr. Ron Monteperdo from Carteret Community College. And in our last article, Robert couldn't be with us this morning for our recording, but he sent us along this one that comes from the Federalist. It's called 4 Ways to Reduce Stress and Materialism This Christmas. In one way or another, this article pretty much is reprinted every year. I think I've seen it some fashion or another. This is by Nicole Russell. It says, try as we may, Christmas can feel overscheduled and materialistic instead of significant and joyful. Here's a few ways I'm going to try to make Christmas a little more meaningful for my family this year. 1, saying less is more. Mark, you've got small kids. Less is more. You get away with that?
We try. We honestly try. In fact, this little thing in here,
it's a good mantra here.
Each child gets something he wants, something she needs, something to wear, and something to read. That's a thing in our house. My wife says that. I'm not sure if I like it, but that doesn't matter, to tell you the truth. But we do. We get this. We get this kind of thing, which is so interesting that at Christmas. This is sort of, and you get sermon after sermon about this. Don't get caught up in the hype of Christmas and all of these kinds of things, and it's difficult. I mean, because we're bombarded with it on some level, and really, it's part of our identity as Americans. Black Friday, all of those things, they give us a certain kind of identity. It might not be a good identity that we have, but we sort of get into it.
And every year, pretty much, we see one story or another that usually runs like this. I saw it on ABC, I think, this year, where one family decides they're not going to do Christmas. They said their kids have all been crazy and they're all on the naughty list, and so they're not going to do Christmas this year. And so they interviewed the family, and this was a very sweet family, and the parents had apparently expressed this in a very correct way, not an angry way, in that the kids bought into the idea that they're going to do charitable things this Christmas. And they had gotten excited even about planning the charitable events they were going to do. I don't think I could have ever gotten away with that in my house. In fact, my adult children, the one has just sent me a little wish list while we were recording here today. So, Ron, how do you handle the less is more idea?
How do we handle the less is more idea?
Or number 2 here is actually adjust expectations too. About about what people expect to happen at Christmas.
Yeah, we don't do that. We always say we're going to do that. I don't have much to contribute to this because every time I try to work it out and I think there's agreement, it doesn't work out that way. People just have it, oh, there's nothing here? Oh, we're not going to have gifts? Well, but I thought, and then I find myself holding the bag.
Right.
To do that. Yeah. We can't escape it. And I think the hype with material things is bad enough, but I also think we hype it up in a spiritual way. To be sure, it's the incarnation, and that's the objectification of good. And I think a lot of us expect happiness and joy. It's almost like we get in to go to nirvana, from December 24th to December 26th.
Well, to noon on December 25th, maybe.
Okay. All right.
It's pretty much over by then.
Yeah, well, but then again, it doesn't, it just simply goes away, which leads me to, Mark and I were talking when you'd stepped out earlier before, Ben, about Advent is, it's waiting,
Right.
When even when it's over, we're still waiting.
Yes.
And I guess I'm being a spoil sport here and raining on the Christmas parade.
Well,
Go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, actually, in my congregation at the beginning of Advent, actually the week before, I had said, "Oh, great, Advent is coming!" Trying to, and just making fun, a little satire on the fact that nobody gets excited about that.
Yeah.
When that's exactly what we ought to be. We ought to be on the edge of our seat during Advent.
Yeah, I'm reminded as a pastor, I don't want to take this too, down a notch too much, but I'm reminded as a pastor during Advent and Christmas is there's a song, it's the most wonderful time of the year.
Yes,
have you ever heard this?
right,
Okay.
right.
And for some people in our congregations, it is the worst time of the year. I don't mean to bring up the dialectic here, but sometimes the most wonderful time of the year for people who have lost people or anything becomes the worst time of the year.
No, and then that's very true. In fact, this week, First Baptist Church in Jacksonville held a seminar on just that, on that very subject. And it's I see a growing number of groups that are trying to specifically address that, not just with a kind word or two in a sermon, but actually to have some gathering, and their purpose, their express purpose, was to help people feel the joy again.
Yeah.
So I think there's an effort that we all need to make there, and that's part of that lowering these expectations about this being all this wonderful thing. Now, number 3 on this list here, though, is interesting because I'd never heard of this one part before. Take Santa and the shelf elf down a notch. Mark, do you know about the shelf elf?
I do know about the shelf elf. We do not have one because my kids are sitting right out here in the lobby, and if I got them in here and asked them, what do you guys think about the elf on the shelf? They would say, that is the creepiest thing we've ever seen. We do not have one in our house. I guess the premise of the elf on the shelf, I could get this wrong, but it's an elf that watches over you during the time leading up to Christmas.
It explains it here. The elf is a book and a doll set that came out in 2005, sits on the shelf and watches the kid. If they're bad, he tells Santa. And said bad things get zilch for Christmas, So, these days, that elf on the shelf probably has a camera in it.
Yeah, I understand why my kids would think that was
Banana
terrifying. That kind of big brother up there watching.
Well, we have an elf on our shelf, and I'm largely the reason that it's there. I just sort of love it.
You'd like to have that reminder of accountability?
Well,
Is that the idea?
It reminds me of good things. It's like the fun of putting up a Christmas tree.
I tell people that's why I hang icons in my office at church, with Mary looking at you, or St. Francis looking at you. You have to behave yourself.
Well, the one other thing on here is says slow down to remember the reason, and we get reminded of that, I think, frequently, and sometimes we do that. And this is one case where my wife and I, our own bad habit of procrastination, I think actually helps here, is that because we do put off a lot of things, or we've been so busy we haven't gotten around to some of the other traditional things of Christmas, of decorating and shopping and all that, is that we've had a chance to actually explore some of those other things. And sometimes sometimes it's inadvertent that we ended up kind of by default helping with the Christmas program this year, and it ended up being very sweet, very simple, very sweet expression of a few songs and readings, and it came off very nicely, and helped us to remind us of this reason, to be able to go back and explore that. But in the meantime, though, we do have to remember that here as we speak, this is going to be the Sunday before Christmas. A lot of people are making those plans, and you're going to have a lot of people traveling and trying to get to Grandma's on time. And as you brought up before, it is a hectic time when people, it's not just remembering persons who are lost, but we get so distracted.
We do.
By everything else.
And it is very important to make time, quantity of time, to think about, what Christmas is or what Advent is. Ron was saying, you have to make specific time. Just one thing that we do at our house, 6:30 every night during Advent, we have our wreath, we light our candles, and we read a short devotion with all of our kids squirming around. We have 4, and it is the best part of my day. I know that sounds cheesy, but it is the best part of my day. It's 6:30, we sit down, and then after we do the devotion and the little kids pray and one of the adults prays, we fight over who gets to blow out the candles. And it is just the most wonderful thing that we do during Christmas. And we do it before we open anything on Christmas or anything like that. But I think really it really comes down to, you have to choose to spend that time in prayer and reflection. There is a million other ways we can spend our time, but we just have to say, look, this is the time. Set a schedule. This is what we do on this day. And it really will help with every single one of those things on that list. Less is more, adjust expectations. It'll take the elf down a notch, if you're lighting candles and praying in the evenings. It just God will take care of those things if you'll just set quantity time down with God, I really think.
We all have big plans for Christmas, family, those sort of things are coming around.
The usual things. We're going to have some friends over friends and family for Christmas dinner, and it'll be the usual smooth mix of adults and 3-year-olds who will get on famously, and everything will come off on time.
Well, here's our typical holiday arrangement: is that I have no idea who's going to be there.
It just happens. Right?
It just happens.
That's wonderful.
Well, we wish all of you the merriest of Christmases, but also the most faithful of Christmases and blessed ones as well. And we'll see you in the new year.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.